An elderly man in a navy cap was asked to switch seats without reason. Most passengers stayed silent until the pilot stood up, walked to the back, and gave him the respect no one else had. Harold T. Merriweather wasn't the type to demand much. At 76, his knees weren't what they used to be, but he still walked with the quiet posture of someone who'd spent most of his life earning respect without needing to raise his voice. He stood patiently in line at Gate 6 of Middle Georgia Regional Airport, one hand gripping his boarding pass, the other resting lightly on the handle of a modest black suitcase. He wore a brown cardigan, slacks pressed earlier that morning, and a Navy veteran cap with faded gold lettering. It didn't scream for attention, but it didn't need to. Some folks noticed it. Most didn't. Harold didn't care either way. Flight 228 to Colorado Springs was nearly full. It wasn't a vacation. He was flying out to meet his newborn great-grandson. His granddaughter Rhonda had called him a week earlier, voice trembling with emotion, saying, "Papa, I want you to be the first to hold him after me. You're the reason I made it through everything." That was enough to get him to book the ticket the same night. As Harold walked down the jet bridge, a flight attendant at the aircraft door greeted passengers with rehearsed cheerfulness. "Good morning. Welcome aboard." He nodded politely. No smile. Not out of rudeness. Just never saw the point in forcing something that wasn't real. When he reached his assigned seat, 12B, aisle seat, he placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, slid into the chair with a quiet exhale, and pulled a weathered paperback from his coat pocket. The title had worn off years ago. He knew every word anyway. The seat beside him remained empty. Window seat taken by a teenage girl already glued to her phone. Middle seat, vacant. He liked it that way. But less than 5 minutes later, a different flight attendant approached, this one younger, blonde ponytail, tight like a drum, clipboard in hand, eyes darting over the cabin. "Sir?" she asked, voice tight but polite. "I need to ask you to move to another seat. There's been a last-minute change." Harold looked up, puzzled. "Ma'am, I'm in 12B. That's what's printed on my ticket." "Yes, I understand," she replied quickly. "But there's been a seat mix-up, and someone's been reassigned to this row. Would you mind moving to a seat in the back?" He blinked. "Is there something wrong with this one?" She paused just a little too long before smiling. "No, nothing wrong. Just a reassignment. We really appreciate your cooperation." The teenager in the window seat didn't even look up. Harold glanced around. Other passengers nearby were suddenly quiet. A man in 14A, tall, maybe mid-30s, watched closely. Harold shrugged and stood up slowly. "All right. No problem." He reached for his bag, but she stopped him. "You can leave that overhead. We'll bring it to you." He raised an eyebrow. "That necessary?" "Just easier that way, sir." She led him down the aisle toward the back of the plane. As they walked, another flight attendant was helping a suited man with salt and pepper hair settle into 12B. He looked irritated, like he'd paid for comfort and wasn't about to be denied it. Harold didn't say a word. When they reached the last row, the attendant gestured. "Right here, 31E, aisle seat." He took his seat, this time next to the lavatory. The air back here felt a bit heavier, but Harold didn't complain. He placed the paperback on the tray table, leaned his head back, and stared at the ceiling. A few rows ahead, the man from 14A, Thomas Gaines, leaned toward the woman next to him. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "She didn't even give him a reason," the woman replied under her breath. "He had a seat. That was his." Thomas shook his head, eyes narrowing. In 31E, Harold closed his eyes for a moment. The hum of boarding noise faded into the background. He wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of moments like this that came and went too often, moments where people chose not to see you. But something about today would turn out different, even if Harold didn't know it yet. The plane's engines whirred as final passengers boarded. Flight attendants moved up and down the aisle like a practiced routine, checking latches, closing overheads, flashing smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. But Thomas Gaines, still in 14A, wasn't paying attention to any of that. He kept looking toward the back. He didn't know Harold T. Merriweather. Had never seen him before that day. But something about the way the older man quietly accepted being pushed aside, it rubbed Thomas wrong. "Excuse me," he said, flagging down a passing flight attendant. Not the same one who'd relocated Harold. This one was older, more experienced, judging by the lines around her mouth. "Can I ask, was there really a mix-up with that seat?" The older gentleman who was in 12B. She hesitated. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't know the full details. Let me check." She moved on before he could follow up. Thomas sighed and sank into his seat. In row 31, Harold folded his jacket neatly over his lap. He didn't want to wrinkle it. Never did, even when no one was looking. That jacket had seen weddings, funerals, and 3 graduations. He looked ahead, trying not to notice the toilet sign blinking a few feet away. 2 seats down, a toddler was already screaming. 1 row up, a woman in a neck pillow was video chatting until a crew member firmly told her to hang up. No one made eye contact. Harold reached for his book again, but didn't open it. Instead, he stared at the back of the seat in front of him, as if it might open up and offer him something more interesting. In 12B, the new occupant, a man in a tailored blazer with noise-cancelling headphones, was sipping from a branded water bottle and scrolling through his phone. He looked settled. Entitled. Oblivious. The ponytailed flight attendant checked on him twice before takeoff. She never looked back at Harold. Thomas couldn't take it anymore. He clicked the call button. It lit up yellow. The same ponytailed attendant appeared. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to understand," Thomas said. "That man, back in 31, he had this seat. Why was he moved?" She gave a practiced smile. "There was a last-minute change, sir." "What kind of change?" "I'm not at liberty to share passenger details. Please understand we do our best to accommodate everyone comfortably." "But he had the seat. You made him move for that guy?" Thomas tilted his head toward 12B. She didn't flinch. "I'm afraid that's all I can say. If there's anything else I can assist you with, there isn't." She walked away, just like that. The doors closed. The engine noise grew louder. A voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 2228 with service to Colorado Springs. Flight time today will be approximately 3 hours and 15 minutes. Harold heard none of it. He wasn't bitter. He never let himself be. But he did remember. He remembered a bus in Macon, 1964. He remembered a hospital waiting room where no one would talk to him. He remembered standing in line in uniform, being passed over again and again. It didn't break him then, and it wouldn't now. But it stayed with him. In the cockpit, Captain Roy Delaney glanced at the passenger manifest one last time. The name Harold Merriweather didn't jump out at him, but the handwritten note in the corner did. A quiet message from a gate agent. "Former Navy, vet cap, row 12B, moved?" Delaney frowned. That wasn't protocol. Veterans were usually given priority, not reassigned without cause. He made a mental note to check on it after takeoff. Back in 31E, Harold finally opened his book. The pages were worn, some corners bent, but it calmed him. It always had. He didn't need sympathy, just his space. His story had already been written, long before this flight. But someone on that plane had just realized Harold wasn't another quiet passenger, and they weren't going to let this slide. The plane rolled onto the runway, engines roaring as the cabin gently rattled. Seatbelt lights flickered overhead. Thomas leaned back, gripping the armrest a little tighter than usual. His gut told him this wasn't just a clerical error or a seat switch done in haste. It felt deliberate. Worse than that, it felt familiar. He glanced down the aisle toward row 31, barely able to make out Harold's head above the seatbacks. The man wasn't slouched, wasn't sulking. He sat upright, eyes on the window, still holding the same book in his lap. Thomas hadn't said anything yet, but his silence was beginning to feel like complicity. In the row across from him, a woman in her 50s whispered to her husband, "I saw him sit there first. He didn't do anything wrong," the husband grunted, annoyed but not moved to act. Then the plane lifted. With a firm surge, they were in the sky. A toddler shrieked briefly from the back, and a bell chimed as the seatbelt sign turned off. The flight crew began preparing the beverage carts. People settled into movies, magazines, and conversations. But in Thomas's mind, the way Harold had been treated still looped like a scene that wouldn't leave. He turned to the passenger beside him, a guy maybe in his 20s, baseball cap on backward, earbuds in. Thomas tapped him lightly on the shoulder. "Hey," he said. The guy popped out one earbud. "What's up? Did you see what happened earlier? That old man. They moved him out of this seat. Just made him go sit by the toilet." "Yeah," the guy said. "Kinda messed up. But I mean, what can you do, right?" Thomas stared at him. "You can say something." The guy gave a little shrug. "Not really my fight." That hit harder than Thomas expected. He leaned back again and closed his eyes. His father used to say silence was the most dangerous thing in the world. "It's what cowards wear," he'd once said. "Looks just like peace, until you look close." He didn't want to be a coward, but he didn't want to get kicked off the plane either. So he sat there, fuming, chewing on the inside of his cheek. Down in row 31, Harold turned the page of his book, slowly. He wasn't reading. His eyes kept drifting to the aisle, then to the window, then back again. At one point, a flight attendant walked by without looking at him and bumped his elbow. She didn't stop or apologize. He said nothing. He rubbed his forearm lightly, then folded the photo from his wallet back into the book's inner cover. A black and white image, yellowed with time. 5 men in uniform, all smiling. One of them had his arm around a younger Harold, who was grinning wide. All but one of those men were gone now, and Harold didn't need a plaque or a ceremony. He just wanted a moment of dignity in his old age, a decent seat and a little peace. But that moment had been taken. Near the front, the man now sitting in 12B leaned toward the ponytailed flight attendant. "Thanks again for sorting that out," he said. His voice wasn't low. "I paid extra for that aisle. Wasn't about to squeeze next to some guy that smells like a garage." She gave a quick nod and said nothing. Thomas heard it. And that was the last straw. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and walked toward the galley at the front of the plane. He didn't know what he was going to say or do, but sitting down and pretending nothing had happened was no longer an option. But as Thomas reached the front, someone else was already one step ahead of him, and what came next would silence every voice on that flight. Captain Roy Delaney stood in the cockpit doorway, hand still resting on the back of the pilot's chair, his eyes scanning the cabin from front to back. He wasn't looking for turbulence or technical problems. What he saw was something he couldn't ignore. Row 31, an old black man, posture straight, eyes steady, sitting quietly next to a bathroom door like he didn't belong anywhere else. Roy had flown commercial for nearly 2 decades after a 10-year run in the Air Force. He'd seen a lot of odd things over the years: entitled passengers, aggressive drunks, even a dog that once had to be zip-tied to its carrier mid-flight. But this was different. Before takeoff, he'd seen Harold being moved from row 12. He'd asked the gate crew later for clarity, and one of them mentioned the switch like it was nothing. "Just some mix-up," they'd said, already logging their final reports. But Roy could read a lie even when it was wrapped in policy speak. Now, cruising at 34,000 feet, he stared down the aisle and decided he wasn't going to sit back and do nothing. In the rear of the plane, Harold had stopped trying to read. He was staring out the small window at nothing in particular. He wasn't angry, just tired in a way that didn't come from walking or waiting, but from being reminded, once again, that people could pretend you weren't there. Then something shifted. The intercom clicked. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to thank you for flying with us today. We'll be reaching cruising altitude shortly, and I'll ask the crew to pause service for just a moment. I need to step out and address something directly." The tone of his voice was calm, steady, but it had weight. Passengers looked at each other. A few paused their movies. One child leaned over to his mother, whispering, "Did something break?" In row 14, Thomas turned in his seat, eyebrows furrowed. He glanced back toward row 31. Harold didn't move. Not yet. The cockpit door opened fully, and Captain Roy Delaney stepped into the aisle. Not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. He walked past the first few rows, nodding slightly to a flight attendant who instinctively moved aside. People were watching now. Whispers rippled up and down the plane. The man in 12B, the one who'd taken Harold's original seat, looked up, confused, then annoyed. Delaney kept walking. He passed row 20, then 24, then 28. Row 31. He stopped. Harold looked up, surprised. The cabin fell silent. Delaney took a breath. He didn't make a speech. Not yet. He didn't explain himself. He just looked Harold Merriweather in the eye. And then, with hundreds of eyes watching, he brought his hand up. Sharp, practiced, respectful, and saluted. Harold blinked. For a moment, he didn't move. Then slowly, his hand rose too. Not out of ceremony, but instinct, recognition. A signal between two men who'd worn the same uniform decades apart. Delaney's voice was steady but clear, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Mr. Merriweather served 3 tours in Vietnam. He pulled 6 men from a fire at Da Nang in 1970. That man has more courage in his bones than most people will know in a lifetime. You could have heard a pin drop. Then someone clapped. Just one person at first. Then 2 more. Then the whole plane erupted. Applause filled the cabin. Heads turned toward the back. The woman near Harold wiped her eyes. The ponytailed flight attendant stood by the beverage cart, frozen. Thomas exhaled deeply. Relief, maybe. Or just pride that someone finally stood up. Not with anger, but with honor. Harold said nothing. He simply lowered his hand, eyes locked with Delaney's. But the salute was only the beginning, because Delaney hadn't come all the way back just to give praise. He had one more thing to do, and no one on that plane was ready for it. Captain Delaney didn't break eye contact. Even as the applause faded and the passengers began whispering again, he remained in that tight aisle space, feet planted beside row 31. The lights above flickered slightly, casting a soft glow on Harold's face. Delaney lowered his hand and took a small step closer. "Sir," he said, voice even. "Would you allow me to escort you back to your original seat?" Harold blinked slowly. Unsure. "Back to 12B?" Delaney nodded. "That's where you were assigned. That's where you belong." A pause. Then Harold responded in a low voice only Delaney could hear. "I don't want to cause trouble, son. I've had enough of that in my life." Delaney's mouth curved. Not quite a smile, but something close. "You're not causing trouble. You're correcting a mistake. And I'm here to make sure it stays corrected." It was quiet again. Then Harold stood. He did it slow, out of necessity, not hesitation. The woman sitting next to him scooted back to make room, watching him like she was watching something sacred. Thomas Gaines, peering down from row 14, could hardly believe what he was seeing. The 2 men turned down the aisle together, one in full uniform, the other in soft brown and worn-out shoes. They didn't speak, and they didn't need to. As they passed each row, passengers leaned into the aisle, watching. Some clapped again. Others nodded quietly. A man in business class even put his laptop down for the first time all flight. When they reached row 12, the suited man currently occupying Harold's seat, the one who had scoffed earlier about smelling like a garage, looked up with irritation. Delaney stopped in front of him. "Sir," the captain said plainly, "this seat is no longer yours." The man squinted. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. This seat belongs to Mr. Merriweather. You were not assigned here. You're going to move." The man looked around, then gave a forced laugh. "Is this some kind of joke? I paid extra for—" "I'm not going to debate you on this in front of the entire cabin," Delaney interrupted. "You can choose to move voluntarily, or I can ask ground security to meet us when we land." Silence. The man grumbled, grabbed his things, and stormed down the aisle toward the rear. No flight attendant offered to help this time. Delaney turned back to Harold and motioned toward the aisle seat. "It's yours again." Harold sat down, quiet and composed. Delaney then did something no one expected. He sat down too, right in the middle seat next to him. The cabin murmured again. "You don't have to do that, son," Harold whispered. Delaney smiled this time. "I want to." For the rest of the flight, the captain remained in that middle seat. He answered questions when passengers leaned over. He took a photo for a kid in 13C. And when the beverage cart rolled through, he handed Harold a ginger ale and said, "On the house." Back in 31, the toddler had fallen asleep. The air felt lighter somehow. Thomas sat back in his chair and finally relaxed, watching Harold sip from the plastic cup like nothing had ever happened. Like he'd always been in that seat. But people noticed now. A girl in 15D drew a little sketch of the moment, just a quick doodle of two men sitting side by side, one with silver hair and a book, the other in uniform. They'd remember this flight for a long time. But what most passengers didn't know, what only a few would later find out, was the real reason Harold had been moved in the first place. And when the truth came out, it would leave a stain no apology could clean. The cabin had changed, not just in tone, but in the way people looked at each other, more thoughtful, more aware. Nobody was tapping screens or flipping through magazines anymore. Eyes kept drifting toward row 12, where two men now sat shoulder to shoulder, one a retired veteran, the other a captain still in uniform, acting not out of protocol, but something deeper. A few passengers tried to go back to normal, muttering about the flight delay, sipping lukewarm coffee, but it didn't stick. Something about what had just happened kept hanging in the air. In row 12A, the teenage girl who'd been there since the start finally looked up from her phone and said quietly, "Sir, were you really in Vietnam?" Harold turned, surprised by her voice. "Yes, Mom. Long time ago now." "Did you really save 6 people in a fire?" Harold gave a small, tired smile. "I just did what anyone would have. We were in a bad spot. You don't think too hard in the moment. You just move." The girl nodded slowly, chewing her lip. Then she did something even she didn't understand. She reached into her bag, pulled out a chocolate chip cookie wrapped in a napkin, and handed it to him. "For your great-grandkid," she said, almost too quiet to hear. "Or just for you." Harold accepted it like it was a medal. From across the aisle, Thomas caught the exchange. He smiled without meaning to. Further down the plane, a few murmurs spread. Why was he moved in the first place? Did someone complain? That was wrong. Straight up wrong. The whispers weren't loud, but they carried. The flight crew could hear them too. In the galley, the ponytailed flight attendant stood stiff, arms folded, eyes darting to the cabin and back to the service checklist in front of her. She hadn't spoken since the salute. Another attendant, the older one with the tired smile, leaned in close. "You need to tell the captain." "I didn't do anything wrong," she muttered. "You bypassed seat assignment protocol," the older woman whispered. "That's wrong, and you know it." The younger one stiffened. "I was told by the desk crew it was fine." "No. You told the desk crew to log it as a mix-up." "I heard you." She said nothing. Back in row 12, Captain Delaney took a small notepad from his jacket pocket. He wrote something, folded it, and handed it to Harold. "Give that to your granddaughter. It's not much, just a letter of acknowledgement. But if anyone ever questions what happened today, this'll remind them someone saw it." Harold took it, nodding once. "Appreciate it, son." They sat quietly for a while, listening to the hum of the engine, the soft rustle of bags shifting in overhead bins. And then, from a few rows up, came a voice. "Thank you, sir." It was a man in a plaid shirt, probably mid-40s. "My dad served too. Didn't always get the respect he deserved." Harold looked at him, nodded slightly. More voices followed. "You should have never been moved." That was wrong. "Glad you're back where you belong." Harold didn't respond to each one. He didn't need to. Sometimes presence is louder than words. And Delaney? He just kept sitting there, legs folded, hands resting on his lap like he had nowhere better to be. Because in that moment there wasn't. But as the flight settled into calm again, a private conversation was already happening between crew members up front, and the truth behind Harold's reassignment was about to surface. Up front, behind the thin galley curtain that separated the crew from the first few rows of passengers, tension was brewing like hot water left too long on the burner. The older flight attendant, Denise Langley, 28 years with the airline, folded her arms and gave the younger one a look that didn't need explaining. "You want to tell me now?" Denise said quietly. "Or wait until Roy asks you himself?" The younger woman, Alyssa, stared at the floor. Her name tag had started to shift, nearly falling off the edge of her blouse. She pulled it back into place out of habit. Anything to avoid eye contact. "I didn't mean for it to be a thing," she whispered. Denise raised an eyebrow. You moved a Vietnam vet to the rear of the plane, out of his paid seat. Now the captain's sitting next to him, and half the passengers are whispering. So, yeah, it's a thing. Alyssa's jaw tightened. Look, the guy who wanted 12B? He's one of our platinum-tier flyers. He didn't want to sit next to... that man. Denise leaned in, voice low and sharp. You mean Harold? Alyssa said nothing. So you lied about a seat mix-up? Denise continued. Just to keep one man comfortable at the cost of someone who's probably earned more stripes than that suit in row 1 ever will. I was trying to avoid a scene. Well, congratulations! You made a bigger one than you can imagine. From just outside the curtain, another crew member coughed. Softly, like a warning. Captain Delaney was making his way forward again. Denise turned and walked out first. Alyssa stood still. Delaney stepped into the galley. Denise, he said, nodding once. Then his eyes turned to Alyssa. You got a second? Alyssa didn't answer at first. She just moved aside as he stepped in. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. His voice stayed even. I just want to know how a confirmed seat assignment for a man with military service and early boarding status got changed at the last minute. Alyssa swallowed hard. It wasn't meant to be personal, Captain. A frequent flyer wasn't happy about his neighbor. I tried to fix it without it getting loud. Delaney narrowed his eyes. So you gave his seat away? Yes. To the person who was there first, who had the assigned seat, who didn't complain, who followed every rule. She nodded. You know, Delaney said, voice low. When I was 26, I flew combat missions over Basra. One time, we ran out of fuel mid-route and had to land in hostile territory. My wingman didn't make it. The guy who pulled me out of that mess was black. He carried me half a mile under fire, bleeding from his own shoulder. That man wasn't a mix-up. Alyssa looked down. Delaney exhaled. When we land, you'll be writing a report. I'll be filing one too. I can't let something like this slide. Not today. Not ever. She nodded again, still not saying a word. Delaney left her standing in the galley and walked back toward the cockpit. On the way, he paused near row 14. Thomas, right? He asked. The man blinked, surprised. Yeah, that's me. Thank you, Delaney said. For noticing. For caring. Thomas gave a modest shrug. Didn't feel like I had much choice. You did, Delaney replied. And you made the right one. He moved on without waiting for thanks. In row 12, Harold sat quietly. Folding the napkin, the cookie came into a perfect little square. He didn't know about the conversation in the galley, didn't know the truth had finally come out, but the change in the air told him enough. People walked differently now, talked differently, looked at him, not with pity but with a kind of reverence usually reserved for memorials or folded flags handed to widows. But Harold hadn't flown to be honored. He'd flown to meet someone. And that moment was finally getting close. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the pilot's voice returned to the intercom. Folks, we've started our initial descent into Colorado Springs. Please return to your seats, fasten seatbelts, and stow all items. It was the usual routine. But nothing about the final stretch of this flight felt ordinary. Row 12 had gone quiet. Harold sat back, cookie still untouched in the folded napkin. He'd barely spoken in the last half hour, not out of discomfort, but reflection. He could feel the weight of what had just happened, even if he hadn't asked for any of it. Captain Delaney had returned to the cockpit. His voice sounded the same over the intercom, controlled, clipped, but the man behind it had clearly shifted gears. He wasn't just guiding the plane anymore. He was setting a tone. Thomas Gaines watched Harold from across the aisle. For most of the flight, he'd wrestled with whether to say something directly. Now, with landing minutes away, he decided it mattered more than ever. He leaned slightly toward Harold. Sir, I just wanted to say, I saw what they did to you. That wasn't right. Harold turned. His expression was calm, unreadable. Thomas continued. I was going to say something, but I didn't. Not at first. And I won't forget that. You handled it with a kind of grace I'm not sure I could have managed. Harold studied him a moment. Then he replied, You spoke up eventually. That's more than most. Thomas swallowed hard, nodding. You headed to see family? Great-grandson, Harold said softly. First time. A woman across the aisle leaned over. Well, he's lucky to have you. The whole plane saw that today. Harold gave the faintest smile. Hope he grows up in a world where we don't have to keep learning the same lessons. As the plane descended, more passengers began to approach. Some shy, some direct. A mother with 2 boys walked over during the final taxi. My dad served in Vietnam too, she said. Didn't talk about it much. I wish he'd lived long enough to see someone get recognized like that. Harold shook her hand gently. He saw enough to know he was part of something bigger. Even the teenage girl in 12A, awkward and still unsure of what to say, offered, If my dad had seen what happened, he would have done something too. I'm going to tell him about you. The words weren't perfect, but they were honest, and Harold appreciated them more than anyone knew. After the plane touched down, the final taxi was quiet. When the seatbelt sign clicked off, no one stood immediately. People stayed seated, waiting, not out of confusion, but respect. They let Harold move first. As he stood, the captain emerged from the cockpit once again, this time holding a folded paper in one hand. He stopped Harold at the front of the plane. Mr. Merriweather, one last thing. Harold looked up, curious. Delaney handed him the paper. It's a contact at our Veterans Partnership Division. They'd like to speak with you about possibly telling your story on your terms, if you're open to it. Harold took it, but didn't respond right away. Stories like yours matter, Delaney added. I'm just one man, Harold said. Exactly, Delaney replied. One man can make people rethink how they act. I saw it today. Harold looked around. Passengers were watching, still seated. Thomas gave a small wave. He tipped his cap once. Thank you, Captain. Delaney offered a firm handshake. No, sir, thank you. As Harold exited the jet bridge and disappeared into the terminal, his walk wasn't rushed. It was steady. Quiet, but not small. Back on the plane, passengers began to rise slowly, many still reflecting, still processing. Some had filmed the salute, some hadn't. But everyone had felt it. But even after the cameras stopped and the doors closed behind him, Harold's day wasn't finished, because waiting just beyond baggage claim was the very reason he'd taken this flight in the first place. Outside gate B7, the terminal buzzed with the usual chaos, arrival screens blinking, tired travelers dragging wheeled suitcases, airport announcements blending into the hum of conversations and rolling carts. But Harold Merriweather didn't hear any of it. He walked slowly, but with purpose, scanning the crowd as he clutched a simple envelope in one hand. The letter Captain Delaney had given him. In the other, he held a small stuffed elephant. It wasn't much, just something he'd picked up from the airport gift shop before boarding. A tiny token for a life just beginning. Then he saw her. Rhonda. Mid-30s, wearing a navy hoodie, hair pulled back, bouncing gently as she held a baby carrier in one arm and waved with the other. Her eyes were already wet. Papa! Harold smiled, real and unguarded for the first time all day. He walked toward her as fast as his legs would let him. She met him halfway, arms wrapping around his shoulders before he could even get a word out. You made it, she whispered. You doubted me? He said, voice gravelly but warm. She pulled back just enough to hold up the carrier. Meet Miles. Harold leaned down, eyes scanning the tiny face bundled in soft blankets, and something in his chest caught. It wasn't pride. It wasn't even joy. It was something more complicated, something heavier. Because in that moment, staring at the boy he'd waited a lifetime to meet, Harold didn't just see a baby. He saw a chance for things to be different, a chance for that child to grow up in a world where no one would ever ask him to move just to make someone else comfortable. Harold reached in, laid the tiny elephant next to the baby's hand, and whispered, You don't know it yet, little man, but this world's got work to do, and you're gonna help it along just by being you. Rhonda wiped her cheek. You okay, Papa? Harold straightened up. Yeah, just thinking about what I want to tell him when he's older. You'll have time, she said. You're going to be part of everything. First steps, first words, all of it. They sat for a while at the baggage carousel. Rhonda handed him a sandwich she'd brought from home. His favorite, turkey with a little mustard. They didn't talk much. There wasn't a need to. Finally, Rhonda asked, "Was the flight okay?" Harold chuckled softly. "Let's just say it had a few surprises. You look tired." "I'm fine." He paused. "But something happened on that plane I didn't expect." Rhonda looked concerned, but Harold waved her off. "Don't worry. It turned out all right. Some people did the right thing. That's what matters." She studied him a moment, sensing there was more, but she didn't push. Instead, she reached over and rested her hand on his. "You've always had that effect on people," she said. "Make them want to do better." He looked at her, eyes narrowing playfully. "You saying I guilted the world into having a conscience?" "No," she laughed. "I'm saying they looked at you and remembered what decency looks like." Their bags came through. Rhonda stood to grab them. Harold stayed seated, letting the moment linger. He glanced down at Miles, who was dozing peacefully in the carrier. In that tiny face, Harold saw something he couldn't explain. An anchor for all the things he'd once hoped the world might become. But even as he held on to that hope, he knew the lesson wasn't finished yet. One more thing needed to be said, something for everyone who might ever find themselves in that aisle, watching, wondering whether to speak up or stay quiet. 3 days after Harold Merriweather returned home, the airline issued a short statement. It didn't name him. It didn't mention a salute, or a veteran, or the fact that the captain had temporarily left the cockpit to make things right. It simply read, "We are reviewing an incident on Flight 228 involving a seating issue and are committed to ensuring all passengers are treated with dignity and fairness." That was it. No apology, no press conference, no public acknowledgement of what really happened. But Harold didn't need headlines. That flight wasn't about making noise. It was about reminding people how silence can say everything, and how one act of decency can outshine a room full of bystanders. He wasn't waiting for a thank you. He'd gotten all the thanks he needed the moment that little girl handed him a cookie, the second the captain stood in front of him and saluted without fanfare, the minute that young man in row 14 said, "That wasn't right." Those moments, quiet, messy, real, were enough. At home, Harold sat in his favorite chair on the porch, rocking slowly as the afternoon sun dipped low. The folded letter from Captain Delaney rested in the side pocket of his worn jacket. Nearby, a framed photo of Rhonda holding baby Miles sat on the porch table. He didn't replay the incident over and over. He didn't stew or let it make him bitter. He'd seen far worse in his life. But he did think about the way people reacted once one person had the nerve to stand up. It only took one. He thought about the man who gave up the seat, the one who didn't want to sit next to an old black veteran. That man had disappeared down the aisle like smoke. No words, no eye contact. But Harold wasn't angry at him either. Not anymore. Pity, maybe. Or just disappointment. Because that man could have walked off the plane with a story about grace and honor and learning something about the world. Instead, he walked away smaller than he came. Later that week, Thomas Gaines sent Harold a photo, taken by another passenger from 2 rows back. In it, Harold is standing in row 31. The captain is saluting, and everyone is watching. Thomas had written only 2 words underneath the image. "Changed me." Harold smiled when he saw it. That was the thing about dignity. It didn't need to shout. It didn't need bright lights or loud declarations. It just had to stand still long enough for others to feel it. And when someone finally recognized it, really saw it, something shifted in the air. That's what Harold wanted for his great-grandson. Not medals, not headlines, just the instinct to do the right thing, even when it was inconvenient, especially then. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Harold leaned back and closed his eyes. In his mind, he could still hear the words Delaney had spoken in front of the entire cabin. That man should sit wherever he damn well pleases. And it wasn't about the seat. It was never about the seat. It was about being seen, about being counted, about being human. If you ever find yourself in a moment like that, when it's easier to stay quiet than speak, remember Flight 228. Remember the aisle. Remember the salute. Be the person who doesn't wait for permission to do what's right. And if this story made you pause, made you feel something, or reminded you of someone you love, hit subscribe. Because we need more people telling stories that remind us we're all accountable for each other, even 30,000 feet in the air.